Hi, my name is Tony, and I thought it'd be interesting to design a game. I thought it'd be interesting to design a game that I could play with you, so that wherever you are and whenever you're watching this, we could play across time and space. Now obviously that's going to apply some limitations to the game design. Most games derive their fun from responding to the other players. But one genre of game design that's historically been relatively non-interactive is the roll and write. The most famous roll and write is Yahtzee. In Yahtzee, each player takes turns rolling the dice and writing down their results. You could play Yahtzee with 2 people, or 50 people, or you could even play by yourself, just trying to get the highest score possible. So let's talk a little bit about roll and writes. Roll and writes are typically simple. That makes them fairly easy to design, which is another advantage of choosing a roll and write. The gameplay of a roll and write tends to follow a 3-phase structure. 1. Randomly generate an input. 2. Place the input. Typically the input is now permanent and can't be changed. 3. Score the results. In Yahtzee, we generate the input by rolling 5 dice. The process is made more interesting by allowing us to choose how many dice to set aside, with 2 re-rolls. Giving players choices like this is called agency, and it's critical to designing an interesting game. The player needs to be making meaningful decisions. In Yahtzee, the player is weighing the likelihood of getting a good combination of dice based on what they have now and how many rolls are left. Should you go for the easier but lower scoring option, or the less likely but better scoring option? For phase 2, we place the inputs. In Yahtzee, now that you've finished rolling, you decide which section to score, knowing that each section can only be scored once. You make decisions like, do you score your 5s now? Or do you take a 0 in the large straight? Maybe it's only 2 5s, but time is running out on making that large straight at all. Our third phase is the scoring. The goal of a high score is behind all the decisions you make during the game. Roll and writes are very tactical games, meaning you're constantly in the moment deciding between 2 or more options, calculating how to make the best out of what you've been given. For a game to include strategy, there needs to be an aspect of adjusting a bigger set of plans based on each event. Yahtzee doesn't have much strategy. The results of one die roll don't change the strategy you'll bring to the rest of the game. You may adjust your appetite for risk depending on how well your opponent is doing, but only if you have visibility into your opponent's progress. We'll see if we can include some strategy in our game design, but first let's talk about some other roll and writes. Railroad Inc. is a grid-based game, which is a style of game that lends itself well to roll and writes. In a grid-based game, each input is a tile that you place on a grid. Once a tile is placed, it can't be moved. In Railroad Inc., you roll dice that produce these different road or railroad results, which you fill in on the grid. You're trying to connect them up, road to road, rail to rail. You get more points for connecting bigger networks, connecting them to exit points along the outside of the grid, and for reaching higher value squares in the middle of the grid. Grid-based games offer an opportunity for strategy because you're building something. You have an idea of what you'd like the final product to be, but as you're forced to make compromises, you may need to adapt to your larger plan. There are many more roll and write games worth looking into, but this isn't going to be a video cataloging the entire space. So let's move on and start talking about the game mechanics we'll be using in our game. The first thing I want to address is the idea of edges and centers. The game that we're looking at here is called Dwarf Romantic. You're placing tiles and you're trying to match similar edges. So you can see here, I've matched up city to city and it's actually highlighted to show me that connection is valid. So you're rotating the tiles and trying to find the best places to put them. Additionally, you're trying to create larger groups. So it's highlighted all of the buildings to show me that that group is all connected. And I have 3 tiles worth of houses connected together. So the center of the piece, in this case, is being used for continuity, for connecting larger groups. So now, if we look at the basic components of our game, we have a grid, randomly generated tiles, competing priorities, stretch goals and strategy, edges, centers, and what I'd like to add next is theme. Some designers like to start with a theme. Others like to start with the mechanics and find an appropriate theme later. I think I'm in the theme first camp. Having a theme in mind helps create some limitations to respond to. A couple days ago, I lay in bed and I got to thinking about themes. The idea of building a city is a very reused theme, but there's a reason for it. Games like SimCity or City Skylines or Civilization or even Mini Metro are successful for a reason. There's something inherently compelling about city organization. I also found myself thinking about the Discworld book series and Ankh-Morpork. If you're not familiar with the book series, don't worry about it. The only aspect I was considering was the problem of humans, dwarves, and trolls living side by side in an urban environment. Dwarves and trolls do not get along. I imagined each tile could be one of these three races, and you could place them trying to create districts. The idea isn't using the tile edges yet. So I thought, what if we introduce walls and rivers that run along one or more edges of a tile? They could be used to separate trolls from dwarves. So at this point, I'm picturing something like this. We have three types of tiles. We have dwarf, human, and troll. We have two types of edges. We have walls and we have rivers. And before we get any more complex, I want to see what we can do with the pieces that we have here. When you're designing, ideally you want to keep it simple and only introduce complexity to serve needs of the design. So it helps to visualize what an end state might look like. And I've possibly started small here. I only have a grid of 4x4. And I'm looking for things like density and variety. So like, are three different types enough different types, but not too many different types, to create interesting gameplay decisions? Something else I want to think about is how I'm composing these tiles. So you can see the edges, the rivers and the walls are part of a tile. So like this one here, I've actually done improperly. It should be part of one of these tiles. So currently, each tile has either 0 or 1 edge. So that's something to think about, is how many edges do I want? When I'm generating these tiles, do 50% of the tiles have no edges and the other 50% have 1 edge? Given that parameter, you can still have situations like this where a tile is fairly surrounded, right? Because these two neighboring tiles each have a river, and then this tile here has a wall. Maybe it would be overkill to allow tiles to have up to 2 different edges, but then maybe more edges makes more interesting gameplay. They're kind of a double-edged sword, which I think is interesting. They're blocking dwarves from trolls, but they're also potentially getting in the way of your ability to create cohesive districts. Something else that came up as I was assembling this is, should rivers be contiguous? I think it's interesting to have a difference between walls and rivers, right? Walls don't need to be contiguous, rivers do. And rules like this that force your hand create interesting gameplay situations. If you're allowed to place a tile anywhere you want all the time, really the only thing limiting you is trying to connect continuity with existing tiles, which is fine. There's some challenge to that. But if you add an additional complexity, which is rivers need to connect, now it's become twice as challenging to place the tiles where they'll best serve you. So let's revisit what we have now. I've added some more content. So we have the 3 tile possibilities: humans, trolls, and dwarves. I'm also playing around with this idea of markets. A common mechanic is like the wild card. So, what if there was a tile type that could be matched with all of the other tiles? Or maybe just humans and dwarves benefit from it. If more variety is needed to make the game interesting in terms of tile types, I think this could be an interesting one to play with. I've marked it gray for now, because like I said before, we want to try and reduce the number of features unless we need them to make the game interesting. So then we have border possibilities. For each possible tile that's generated, the tile could have no borders, it could have 1 wall, it could have 1 river, or potentially it could have 1 river and 1 wall. Again, I've made this one gray. Now, of course, there's other combinations. You could have 2 walls or 2 rivers. I already think that would be overkill.
But again, that is something I could keep in mind. But I feel like the edge of where this is going to be interesting and having too many obstructions would be one river and one wall. Another reason why I'm trying to limit the possible space of these is we have to generate these. And we don't want a complex system for generating placeable tiles. We want to make that part of the game really easy and fluid. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. So goals. Right now I've kept the goals pretty simple. Connect larger groups of matching tiles. Right? Get as many contiguous humans as you can, get as many contiguous trolls, etc. And then down here we have limitations. So these are like the opposites of your goals. So we want to avoid connecting dwarves and trolls. We're mentioning that rivers and walls provide separation. Obviously, sticking humans between them would do that as well. This additional limitation that we've added is rivers must be contiguous. Something I didn't mention looking at the map, but you might have noticed looking at it yourself, is I was allowing rivers to go off the edge, meaning you could place a river along the edge and assume that you're just seeing kind of a branch of the river running alongside the grid, and then it's going off again. Right? If we toggle back over here, we can see I've got unconnected rivers along the edge. I'm thinking that should be acceptable. If that's not acceptable, that becomes extremely limiting. All your rivers would have to connect to your initial river. And maybe that's the direction we want to go, right? That's another pivot point that we have to work with. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and say that rivers can go off the outside edge. And then the last thing I have here is another idea, kind of playing around with, is there a way to make the three different tiles a little more different? So maybe trolls need to be next to rivers. I've marked this one gray. I would only introduce this one if it's required, but this is another force your hand kind of mechanic that's going to make it a little bit harder. I mean, really what we're going for is having enough levers we can pull to find the right difficulty level. So now let's talk about generating tiles. Currently, there are 9 different possible tiles, which I've illustrated over here on the right. And each of these represents 1 out of 9 possible tiles. So the probability of any one tile is 1/9. And we need to figure out a way of generating these tiles. Now the easiest way, at least mathematically, is to print physical tiles. Like Carcassonne, you have physical paper tiles, and then you flip them over, randomize them, and then you just flip them. One of the nuances of that is the tiles are predictable, right? If you were to draw all the wall or riverless tiles first, you know that wall and river tiles are coming up. The other option is the roll and write, which is you generate these with dice. The interesting thing about a roll and write is it's not predictable. You could conceivably have a game that had no rivers in it at all, and that's a possibility. But if you're figuring out how to roll these, you need to map them to dice. And as we know, dice typically have 6 sides, although we could design this game with dice with more sides, or less sides than 6. 6 is preferred because they're more universal and easier to obtain, and if we're designing a game that anyone can play, we want to make it as easy as possible for them to get the pieces necessary. So we'd like to try and keep this to 6. We have 9, which is not great. So techniques for approaching 6 might be to do something like this. Say that these are twice as likely. We also have the idea of adding marketplaces. Now we're getting closer to 6. We have 5. I mean, we actually have 3 rows of 5, but we'll get to that in just a moment. So if I'm trying to round this out to 6, I'll notice that by adding these, by doubling up on the no walls, no rivers tiles, I'm decreasing the frequency of walls and rivers in the game. So maybe I actually want to go and create river wall pieces, giving us 6. So maybe this is the best place to start. So the way we generate these is by dice. So here we can see the black die is corresponding to the arrangement and this purple die is corresponding to the species, dwarf, human, or troll. So by rolling both of these, you can generate any one of these tiles. So for example, let's say we rolled a 2 on the black die and a 5 on the purple die. That would correspond to generating a tile with a troll and a wall on it. And of course now I'm realizing we didn't have to introduce all that complexity, because we could have done what we did with the purple die with the black die, and that would give us something like this. So for the walls, a 1 or a 2, the rivers, a 3 or a 4, or the no wall, no river, a 5 or a 6. So 2 dice could give us this limited, simple version of the game with only 9 tiles, or 2 dice could give us this larger, potentially more interesting version of the game. And this is actually a really good exercise to go through, because now we have 2 options and we can play test both of them and see which one is more interesting. So before we get started, an area that I think is going to need a little more thought is the final few moves of play. As you're filling in this grid, you might get a situation like this where you have 1 space left. There's no decision really. Whatever's generated has to go in this spot. You have the option to rotate the tile, but a couple things stand out to me. First of all, in this example, we're trying to get a troll piece to connect all these trolls together. We only have 1 out of 3 chance of actually getting the troll piece. So this is a little punishing at the end of the game. I mean, it is something the player can potentially plan for, although that's a fairly sophisticated way of playing, but maybe that's fine. It's something to grow into. But a bigger problem is the river. It may be very possible that someone is unable to complete a river when the game ends. So what do we do with that? A couple of ideas come to mind. One is that we allow incomplete rivers, but we deduct points for them. This adds a little bit of additional scoring complexity, but probably nothing bad. Another option may be to allow the player multiple final tiles and they get to choose which one. There still wouldn't be a guarantee of getting a river, so it doesn't actually solve that problem, although it might reduce the issue of being kind of stuck with your last tile. And so I actually like the idea for that reason. So the last thing we want to discuss is scoring. And I have written out an outline of a fair way, I think, to start with scoring. And let's talk through each of the decisions I made here. So the primary thing that we're scoring for is race continuity. So groups of similar species that are paired up. So I thought about, do you score a point for a singleton? Do you score points for sets of 2? How do the points increase in bonus as you get larger sets, right? You want to encourage players to try to make the biggest sets possible, because that's going to be a challenge. So what I thought is singletons pretty obviously shouldn't score anything. I mean, placing a singleton without any regard for where it is really shouldn't score you anything. I think it is an interesting question if 2 should score. And initially I was thinking it would, but we want to keep the scoring system as simple as possible. So I was thinking if it's like 1 point for 2, what is it for 3? Is it 2 points? I mean, are you kind of just counting the number and subtracting 1? That's one way of doing it. I feel like there's probably an easier way. And I also feel like you want to bump in the score going from 3 to 4. I have a sense that that's really where the difficulty starts to ramp up. 3 isn't terribly difficult, and you really do want to score bigger bonuses for getting those bigger sets. So I thought, what if we have 1 point for 3, and then that jump up to 4, we score 1 point per member, meaning a group of 4 would actually be worth 4 points. Now that is kind of a significant points jump, but it fulfills those other requirements I'm setting. So I think I'd like to play with that. It creates a real goal of getting 4 or more. And once you've got those 4, adding 1 more each successive piece that you add to it gets you 1 more point. So it's not as great as, you know, bridging that group of 4 level, but it's still the best thing you've got going, right? Because achieving another set of 4s is rather challenging. You might as well just keep adding points on to the group that you've already got going. So I think that works, and it's pretty simple. Just 2 short lines here describing it. So then other things to mention for scoring. So humans and dwarves can both count squares. You know what? We're not calling those squares. It's too confusing. Let's call it marketplaces. That might have been what we actually called it above here. Yeah, we called it markets. I think marketplace is the clearest term. And then we have trolls don't count if they're not next to a river. I mostly like this one in here just to add a little bit more variety, make the trolls distinct. It does mean that games with trolls are going to be harder. The more trolls that are generated, the more challenging it is. The other thing I like about this is it adds an additional layer of differentiation between rivers and walls, and it adds some incentive to send rivers through the center of the map, which is our last bullet point here, which is, I think, -1 point for each incomplete river. I thought about deducting more points for a larger incomplete river, but we actually want to incentivize the player to connect those rivers up, right? So we do want them to have one long river, and if they don't manage to complete it, I don't think that should be a huge penalty. So let's take a moment to look at some scoring examples. So here's the demo board that we've been working with, and I've gone ahead and filled in that square with a troll, and we've got the scoring rules up here. So let's start with the dwarves. We're looking for a group of three or more, and we have, it looks like, a group of 5. So a group of 4+ is 1 point per member. I'm not including the top dwarf here because there's a wall separating them. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is 5 points. That's pretty easy. When we look at the humans, there are no groups of 3, so the humans actually don't score anything. So then we move on to the trolls, and it looks like we have a group of 5 contiguous trolls here, but trolls only count if they're bordering a river. So actually we only have 2, and 2 is not enough to score. Now you might say, well, what about these 2? The river reaches up to them. I think, at least my intent when I was coming up with that rule, was that they had to be bordering. I've actually changed the language to bordering to be a little more specific. It seems a little too easy to allow just reaching the a corner to qualify. Now you might say, well, given the number of rivers on this map, it would have been very difficult to manage to line them all up with trolls. And I think that's right, but I also think that this map isn't actually representative of an actual game, because we changed the tiles, and I think there's a lot more river tiles expected than what you're seeing here. So let's just score what we see here. So the trolls don't score, and that's the end of our positive points. So then we need to look for negative points. We don't have any edges shared by trolls and dwarves. We did a good job of separating them because the river blocks them here. But we have an incomplete river. This river goes to nowhere, so it's -1. So this board actually scores 4 points. So let's go through another example board. So in this example, let's score the dwarves first like we did before. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dwarves that are contiguous. And then we have a 6th point here for the marketplace. So we actually have 6 points worth of dwarves here. So let's write a 6. Let's look at the humans now. The humans have 3, but this 4th human is split off by the wall. So 3 is only worth 1 point. So we have 1 point for the humans. Oh, but the marketplace scores for dwarves and humans. So actually the humans go up to 4, which is worth 1 point per member. So we actually get all the way up to 4 points for getting that 4th contiguous piece. So finally, let's look at the trolls. So the trolls have these 5 here that are contiguous. This one down at the bottom is split off by the river. But we'll notice that this troll here is not adjacent to water, so it's not going to count. So we actually have 4 trolls. So that's another 4 points. Now let's look at some negative points. So the trolls and the dwarf are adjacent here, so that's going to be -1. And then we have this river out here. This is -2 points because we have 2 incomplete river ends. So if we add these up, we have 11 points. So one more edge case that I'd like to look at looks something like this. So we have the trolls that are contiguous over here and connected to water, and there's 4 of them. Then we have a troll who's not connected to water. And then we have another troll who's technically contiguous to the rest of the group and is connected to water. And we have a decision here. Does this middle troll count as continuity or not? In general, I think I prefer to be lenient with the player. Players feel a little more satisfied when they don't feel like they're being unfairly robbed of points. So I would lean towards allowing this to maintain continuity. So the trolls here would score 5 points because you have 5 trolls that are touching water that are contiguous.
So we're going to wrap this video up here. Hopefully you found this as interesting as I have. We're going to pick up in the next video with some play testing.
Oh, yeah, and if you're interested in strategic game design, you should check out my game, Respect Money Power 2 on Android, or Respect of the Realm if that's more your style, or California Road Trip if you're into something a little more experimental and story-based.